Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of you for a very thoughtful discussion on this. I've been hard at work on what I call the virtual you protection agenda, which would be privacy, data security, some Section 230 reforms, tightening up the language there in Section 230, and then dealing with antitrust. And I think it's time we realize these are not companies that are in their infancy. They are full-grown companies, their valuations are high, and they are very intentional in the moves that they make. And Ms. Campbell, I appreciate your comments in regard to the intentionality of the moves that these companies are making with how they data mine and track and utilize that information. Baroness, I want to come to you first. You mentioned the contrast between the children's online age gaps in the U.S. compared to Europe. And in the U.S., where we don't consider an adult until you turn 18, but online, children 13 and 14 can easily get full access to certain applications without their parents' permission. And I think this really leaves them vulnerable. And we've mentioned Snapchat a couple of times. And in 2019, I wrote a letter to the CEO of Snap raising the concerns about how child predators were arrested talking to underage children through this app. This is just, as a grandmother, that is something that you just have to say, how in the world can they not find a way to tighten up this process? But you mentioned safety by design. So how do you think that raising the online adulthood age would change the way that companies approach children's privacy on their apps? And talk to me a little bit about how companies in the UK and Europe have adapted to the changes that you all have made.
Yes, thank you for that question. And I think both the chairman and you are speaking powerfully to the fact that the world of tech has transformed immeasurably, but the regulation hasn't kept up. And I don't think that the internet founders had in their mind that this was going to be the interlocutor of all childhood, and this habit, you know, taking the habits and thoughts and feelings of children and capturing them, you know, TikTok, Google, Facebook, Snap, and other unaccountable companies. And I think we should be worried that a child's latest selfie is stored for purposes yet to be decided in some server farm, whether that's in Hubei province in China or in Nevada, USA. So I think that we have a global issue here, which is, as you say, you know, a child of 13 is not an adult, and we must now extend our concern to children up until the age of 18. So adults, we can discuss differently, but children, we have a duty of care to, and we must fulfill that duty of care. To your point about the tech companies, I have a lot of conversations with engineers. And in fact, I always say that if I had £1 or indeed $1 for every time an engineer had said to me, I have never thought about it like that before, I could actually finance our foundation from one end of the year to another. What I mean by that is that we have to change our mindset. We have to think about what it means to be a child in that environment. And immediately, in relation to the code, what they had to do is actually disband direct messaging for certain age groups. They're not they don't have the cognitive ability to work out whether that stranger is friend or foe. Just don't do it. And in the code, it actually says, do not use their data to offer them detrimental material. And that is, you know, don't use their browsing history. Don't use the fact they hovered over something to then to recommend it or rank it or put it into their feed. And so I think that it is actually easier than we think. What it is a commitment, is minimum standards, and it's a very, very clear enforcement path to say this is what you must do. Not this is what you could do or do a bit better, but this is what you must do, because actually childhood is a precious state, and children don't grow up to be good adults unless they have decent childhoods.
Thank you for that. Mr. Egelman, let me come to you, talking about this privacy by design, and you mentioned about how some of the companies use these personal identifiers and how these are used in concert with third-party data sets and algorithms to build more accurate profiles of our children, which is really a frightening thought when you look at the length of time that they can begin to gather that information and follow them. So talk to me a little bit about the safeguards that app developers could be using in order to protect the children's PII.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It actually hits on a few points you brought up earlier too. So one of the biggest problems I see right now with COPPA is that it shifts the compliance burden to lots of small developers who just really don't know what their obligations are, and then invariably, screw up by misconfiguring, some third-party component that ends up sending data, to advertisers or data aggregators. There are also, certainly there are also malicious actors who are intentionally doing that in children's apps, but the net result's the same thing, right? At the end of the day, there's some third party that's building dossiers of children, and whether the data was sent to them because, the app developer knew they were doing that and, because they get paid more to do it, or because something was just misconfigured. The app developers essentially have all the responsibility under the actual knowledge standard right now, because those third parties, just say, oh, well, we didn't know that this is children's data, and therefore we're not liable. And that's currently the state of the world. I disagree actually with something that Professor Campbell said earlier, which is that it's difficult to figure out when apps are child-directed. In many cases, it's not. So that information is public. Like in the Google Play Store, when you download apps, there are categories. And if the app's in the kids category, that means the developer actually went in there when they uploaded the app and clicked the button saying this is a child-directed app. And to their credit, Google has a pop-up that asks them if they're in compliance with COPPA, and of course they, click yes, and now their app is suddenly available in the Play Store. Anyone can actually just visit the Play Store or the Apple, the iOS App Store and see, whether a given app is in the children's category or not, and then use that information to realize that they're likely receiving data from children and take appropriate action, like delete it immediately and not do anything with it. But the fundamental problem is that they're receiving it. A lot of the issues here come from this, the failure to adhere to privacy by design principles. And so there's a whole framework called privacy by design that has several different principles. The most relevant here is data minimization. So data should only be sent when absolutely necessary. In this case, this hits on the internal operations exemption. So there are all of these exemptions for which these persistent identifiers can be collected and then used for tracking purposes. But because there's ambiguity about what's considered internal operations, this data is being collected even though it's not strictly needed. So an example of that, one of the carve-outs is contextual advertising. So contextual advertising is in contrast to behavioral advertising, where you're not receiving ads based on your history of what websites and apps you've visited and played, but instead just what you're doing in the moment. So what's the name of the current app? in theory, the marketing company, is able to infer, given a user who uses this app, this is an appropriate ad to send them. So maybe like a real estate app is going to have ads for, real estate agents or something like that. The point is, though, if it's all contextual, which is allowed under COPPA, by definition, they don't need the persistent identifiers to figure out which individual user that is and create, a dossier about them. And so that's why, I think data minimization, would go a long way here.
Thank you. I know my time's probably up.
Thank you.